Welcome to the Heard on the West Exec podcast. This podcast focuses on discussions for everything you'd like to know about working in the executive branch of the federal government. Hello, my name's Irv Dennis, a board member and CFO of the American Cornerstone Institute. I served in the executive branch in the Trump administration as the CFO of HUD under Secretary Carson. This podcast is part of ACI's program called the Executive Branch for America. That program is designed to educate what it's like to work in the executive branch. Today's topic will focus on White House communications. We're fortunate to have Sean Spicer join us today. Sean is a former White House press secretary and White House communication director under President Trump during 2017. Sean has a long history of communications experience in the Republican National Convention and Congress, and is the author of several books. Sean, thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to have you.
Thanks for kicking it off with me. This is fun.
So maybe we could start off by maybe just providing a little bit of history of your background and what got you into White House communications, what got you interested in the executive branch. And
there's two things. One is I got involved in media and public affairs after college. I had done a lot of political stuff, but I really enjoyed the excitement of dealing with the media, mostly because it was an immediate reaction, right? So if you were working to get a message or a story, you knew at the end of the day, did you succeed? Conversely, if there was a bad story, could you kill it? Could you shape it? And there was some certainty about knowing that you'd done your job within a confined amount of time, right? So if you're a legislative staffer, it might take you a year or 5 years to pass some bill or an amendment. If you're certain parts of the campaign, you're waiting to the end to find out if you did your get out the vote effort. But when you're dealing with the media, whether it's a campaign or in government, you generally know to some degree on a day-to-day basis whether you're moving the ball forward or not. With respect I served in the Bush administration, so that's a whole separate story. With respect to President Trump and serving in that White House, I had been at the RNC for 6 years, which is 3 cycles, frankly unheard of, because generally speaking, the cycles every 2 years, a new staff comes in, a new chairman comes in. It's a lot to deal with, right? It takes a lot out of you. It's very demanding on your schedule and your time. And I just cycle after cycle. Reince Priebus was the chairman. He had really wanted to keep building on some of the projects and efforts that he had launched, and I was excited about it. I loved it, and so I stayed with him. In 2016, we had this really unique opportunity. We had a candidate that wasn't a political being, right? Donald Trump was a businessman, a reality star, a real estate tycoon. And so when he won the nomination, became the presumptive nominee, he didn't have a cadre of people. He hadn't been a governor or a senator. And so he relied on us disproportionately in a way that historically had been the case. And so suddenly I found myself, I always tell people, by the way, that like in the past, the RNC was always like the JV, right? You're on the team, you get a jersey, but you're not a starter. Okay. This time it was different because they welcomed us into it. They said, hey, we need your help. And I found myself going back and forth to Trump Tower real quick. I developed a relationship with President Trump, flew around the country with him on the plane and at Trump Tower. So when he won, I know you've got a long history in business, and you probably would interview people. And for this case, I'd love to tell you there's this long application process. It was just President Trump. Look, there was a cadre of folks, a small cadre of folks that had been with him. I have pictures. It's funny going back sometimes in May of 2017, right when Indiana primary was taking place, up there at Trump Tower working, and so he had known that certain people had been with him and supporting him and helping him, and so he asked. He said, what do you want to do? And we put together some teams, and then on December 22nd, 1:00 in the afternoon, he called me, and we had done all these drafts. And he said, let's pull the trigger, make it happen, get it out. And I was like, oh my God, you're actually talking about me this time. And so that began my tenure in the Trump administration, getting ready through the transition, and then subsequently the White House. So I wish I could tell you there was some huge glamorous application process, but it's like a lot of things in Washington. It's relationships. So getting your foot in the door. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just that I knew him. I think he had seen my work. He knew my advocacy on behalf of his policies. And so he trusted how I could do the job after seeing me for, 5-6 months. And so that's a large part what worked in my case. When I was in the Bush administration, by the way, same thing. I'd known some folks I wasn't looking for a job. They were in the current administration. They were looking to replace some people at the United States Trade Representatives, which is in the executive office of the president. And they asked, would I consider it? And I had no trade background experience, but it was immediate. It was representing the office in the media. And same thing, all relationship built.
You know, it's interesting. I think he just thought different about the type of people he wanted to bring in.
Oh.
I had 38 years of private sector experience. I didn't know Washington. I didn't know government. I worked on large global commercial accounts. And he just wanted to bring business minds in to help improve the financial fiscal responsibility and IT modernization side of it. I know when I came in, I found it to be a fascinating learning, and I wish I had these 4 years earlier in my career because I would have been a better business advisor.
Well, it's a flip side, right? I think you know, I think the government benefited from your 38 years, so it's always a yin and yang. And it's funny that you bring that up because I know a lot of people who have said, I went into government early, I learned a lot, then I went to the private sector, and then I came back later in my career when I didn't have the constraints maybe financially that you sometimes do because of a government salary. And that's interesting, that I think that's nice. You come in, you kind of maybe learn the system early in your career, go out to the private sector, harness some of those relationships and knowledge, and then come back later.
I do a lot of guest lecturing to universities and young students, and I say the networking you do out of DC is phenomenal. Oh. And you probably have networking.
I got to tell you, it never ceases to amaze me, the conversations where I'll say, well, gosh, I know somebody there, or, you know, so-and-so's sister works there, or, you know, we should follow. But yeah, and it's not just through the White House. Since day one, the folks that I came to DC with in 1994, lived in group houses with, interned with, they're all, for the most part, doing something still to this day. And you know, I can't say that we're batting 100, but or 1,000, but the houses that I lived in had some pretty cool folks that are in politics or in law, in industry, and so it's kind of cool now to still leverage those relationships.
You know, from a communication standpoint, that has to be one of the most difficult jobs inside of the White House. And how do you stay current with what the president's thinking and his messaging, and tell us about that process?
Yeah, it's a great question because I break it down into 3 things. Number one is you've got to be constantly searching for issues. So I would get up at 5 a.m. There's this little, I'd call it like a hotel gym for the executive staff at the White House in the old executive office building, and it's at best a hotel gym. I mean, it's got a couple machines, and I would get in the car, drive straight there, watch, and nobody else was there, by the way. It was just me. So I turned on all the TVs. I had 2 phones going, and I would just search and just start reading. What issues are out there? What are people talking about on social media? What are the morning shows talking about? What's the headline in the Washington Post, the editorial in the Wall Street Journal? I would suck everything in. Then I would meet with my staff, and I'd say, all right, guys, because each staffer had sort of an area that they were responsible for. So you might have a deputy that has HUD, Health and Human Services, Education, and Interior, whatever, right? They got 4 or 5 departments and agencies that are under their and they would come in and say, okay, today, you know, in your world, HUD is doing the following policy initiative, or we got a big announcement coming out of the DOD, and so then I'd say, okay, can you tell me where we are on that? And sometimes we'd call in, people from the counsel's office or Leg Affairs. Walk me through where we are on this issue, process-wise. And that was number 2. And then the third is from the president himself. Yeah. And so I would come in sometimes before briefings or maybe an interview and say, Mr. President, I know from the traffic that I'm seeing, I'm going to get asked about issue A. Now, your staff, your counsel, and your Leg Affairs tell me that we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Is that what you want me to communicate? And sometimes you say, yeah, X and Y, but no Z. I'm not ready to say Z, or Z's not where I am, and let's get the counsel in because I don't agree with that. And so sometimes it would be as simple as I agree. Sometimes it was the opposite. No way. Don't say any of that. And sometimes it was in between. But getting, the thing that was interesting for me that I still find perplexing to this day is so many folks in the media were like, well, did you believe that? If you're a spokesperson, you represent them. My job was to communicate the thoughts and beliefs and policies of the President of the United States. Frankly, anybody who holds that job, no matter who the principal is, that's their job. Not your own, and to express those. And so having access to the president is something that I think was important, and that is something I did not lack. I mean,
Was it daily access?
Oh my God! I would think I probably talked to him at least twice by 8 a.m. Usually the first call I got. Yeah. You know, the press secretary, by the time I would get to my desk, the phone would generally ring, and it was either the White House operator or him himself saying, hey, did you see this story? How are you handling this? What are you doing to get the following out? But I would probably speak to him once or twice before 9 a.m., and then probably by day's end, 10 to 15 times.
Did you travel with him, or did you need to be at the...
So, yes, is the answer. The way that the press office is structured is you've got the press secretary, 3 deputies, and then a few, probably 4 or 5 assistant press secretaries. So I would often, after I got into a groove, send a deputy if it was a domestic trip. So maybe he's going to an event in Washington, D.C. or a day trip. And those were times when you could, you weren't expecting a heavy press day, and you might want to catch up on some stuff, interviews, just work that had backed up emails, whatever. So I would default to travel with him, but then probably every 2 weeks, put somebody else in rotation. It was good for them and it was good for me.
So how did you deal with the press? You talked about the dealing with the president, making sure his message is on point, and I like your comment of you're supporting him, not supporting necessarily your own views. Although I know we all think very much alike with his policies and how he goes about things. But the press has got to be terribly difficult to deal with.
Well, yeah, and I think it's different than, say, under this current administration. You see issue after issue where they get a pass, and no one brings anything up. I mean, so I think the way that the Trump administration was handled by the press is vastly different than anybody else, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. How you handle them, I think, depended on the reporter. There are some professional ones that I dealt with professionally. There were some instigators who were looking for a story or looking for an opportunity to make themselves a meme on YouTube or to get a cable television contract. I always tell people there's a funny story where after I left, there's a reporter named Brian Karem. Brian Karem is the Playboy correspondent. Now, that in itself is an interesting story, but we'll leave it at that. He berated Sarah Sanders at one point and subsequently got a CNN contract. Now, you would think to yourself, did he get the contract because of his amazing reporting or the content of something that he broke or the context? No. It's because he made a spectacle of himself in the briefing room. And that's where I think the big difference was. You're not seeing that under Biden at all. But under Trump, the idea was, can we make somebody a YouTube or an internet star and then harness them?
Interesting. Did you have a lot of interaction with Congress in this role, or was it more?
Yeah, so I had a fair amount. Remember, I'd spent, off and on, probably 12, well, I first came to D.C. in 94, started working on the Hill. So probably close to 20 years off and on Capitol Hill. And D.C. is a very relationship-based place, right? So there might be a member of Congress who just knows me through previous work or association or through a connection, and would call and say, hey, there's an issue that I'd love to talk to you about, or see if we can get in the president's bloodstream, or I need to get some ground truth about what really is happening.
So, once you go through this experience and you make a change out of the administration, where does your mind go from there? I know I everything I do now is networked out of my time at DC versus my time at EY, and I love my time at EY. 38 years, I wouldn't change it other than maybe getting some of this experience earlier. But the networking that we chatted about earlier is just so broad, and there's so many opportunities.
Yeah, look, I think the thing is, it depends on what you do and at what level. So, as I said, when I was younger and working on the Hill, that network was invaluable going forward because people move offices a lot. And so they'll tell you about opportunities, private sector opportunities, public sector, Capitol Hill. Now I use it a lot. I have a podcast, the Sean Spicer Show. It was tough to come up with the name. And so a lot of the people we have on as guests, I'll say, great, I know a guy who used to work at HUD or worked in the Department of Energy, and they're great on this issue. Let's get them on. Or an elected official that we dealt with. There's a lot of people running for office that had served. So there's no bounds to the relationships and the connections and the furtherance of the work. And frankly, that's where I do a lot of political work still as well. And people will call and say, I'm running for office, and can you help with the campaign? And so it never ends. But it depends on what you're looking to do, right? So some people just want a job, and some people want maybe to go lobby or be a contractor of some sort, and then it becomes, okay, those are potential clients. If you're looking for a job, then those are potential jobs. But there's also just a social network too. There's a lot of people who, meet and marry and or date or become roommates. So there's a whole, non-professional aspect of it as well.
Do you have a favorite story from your time in the Trump administration?
I have a few. Yeah. When I grew up as a Patriots fan, Patriots had won, and it actually dates back. I mean, when I was in the Oval one day, I think it was a Friday, and the president Mike Pence had walked in and told him that he was going to go represent the administration at the Super Bowl. I mean, that's such a tough duty. And the president looked at him and said, "Well, Mike, I know Sean's a big Patriots fan. Why don't you take him?" And I was like, "Okay, that sounds
awesome."
Well, so it started there. Then obviously it was the greatest comeback in I think sports history, where the Patriots came back against Atlanta down there in Houston, and the Patriots then subsequently came to the White House, right? So I have these pictures as they're waiting to queue up to go meet the president in the Oval Office of the team in my office. I mean, Rob Gronkowski is sitting there eating chicken tenders with my kids. Edelman's signing stuff. Joe Cardona's a kicker. I mean, a placeholder. He's a fellow Navy sailor, and he was in there. I mean, but you're looking at it going, you're biting yourself saying, when I was a kid, we couldn't afford tickets. Right. Now here's the starting lineup in my office. And as I said, my kids were there, my wife was there, my brother. It was just really a cool moment in an otherwise challenging environment.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was my experience as well, that it's hard work. People don't realize how hard the politicals and the careers work, especially in a time of crisis. But the unique stuff you get to do is unbelievable.
Yeah, and for me, I think what made it more unique was that there was a lot of stuff as press secretary because of your proximity to the president. But this was an opportunity for me to say, hey, kids, come on, right? Most of the days you'd come home and my wife would say, how was today? Well, you wouldn't believe this. The prime minister of such and such came in. And I mean, you can't just bring family and friends to a lot of these meetings. Right. In this particular case, what made it special was the ability to share it with my family.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm glad you had that experience. One thing I did want to ask about, I know you've written some books, and
Four.
So what is that process?
I think this would surprise my English teacher in high school. They're like, you barely read the books. Now
you're an author. What's that process like? Because there's got to be some stuff you want to put in the book, but you can't.
Well, first of all, that's actually a great question, because each book is different. So my first book was called The Briefing. It was really about me and my experience. And I didn't want to write it at first. And the only reason I subsequently wrote it is I kept doing events where someone would say, I read that you said this or believe this. And I thought, why am I leaving it up to others to define me and my experiences? So I wrote that book. Then I wrote two what I'd call cause books. I wrote one called Leading America and then a subsequent one called Radical Nation, that deal with the issues that I think the country faces. And then the last one was a children's book, which is kind of fun to write because I got to actually involve my kids in that. But I'll tell you a funny story. The first draft of my first book, The Briefing, I write the book, and it was sort of like therapeutic. I'm letting a lot out, telling some stories. And my agent at the time calls me and says, do you feel better? And I said, yeah. And he goes, okay, well, let's think about whether or not we want to keep some of that in there. And so there are some stories, nothing that was consequential, but more vengeance, if you will, or just retribution. It was sort of like telling a story about an interaction where I think somebody was kind of probably a jerk. And you sit back and you say, is that really a story that 5-10 years from now that, I'll probably forget why they slighted me or whatever at the time. And it was good advice because I was trying to tell a story and these were tangential to the greater message.
Excellent. Well, I know we're going to run out of time here soon. Any words of inspiration for someone that may be thinking of going into communications or executive branch in general?
Well, one, as I said, I would network as much as I can. And what I mean by that is people, when people come to Washington, D.C. looking for a job, what I always tell them is there's not when you go to someone and say, I'm looking for a job, can you hire me? The answers a lot of times are going to be no. But if you say, I'm looking for a job, can I talk to you? Can I get your advice? Everybody's got advice. So 9 times out of 10, they'll say, sure, I'll give you my advice. Get to know them, try to establish a bond, and that goes to communications as well. Meaning, not everybody wants to be in government. Not everyone wants to be, but there are different, DC is full of people who work in government. Then they work on Capitol Hill. There's associations, there's lobby groups. And each of them is a little different flair of communications. Find out what you like, what excites you. I love the campaign, the thrill and the excitement of winning and losing, and the day-to-day interaction with selling a message to the media. Maybe you're more into videos and social media now, and there's different things that weren't there when I was going through the process. But figure out what excites you and what you like and what you're good at. And then talk to people who do it and say, what do you like about this? Because there is a vast difference between, I think, sometimes what people think the job is. The White House press secretary in particular is a very, very unique job. Most press people are not out there. You're putting your principal out there, your association. And so I think a lot of people look and go, oh, well, what's really cool, you give a briefing every day. There's like no other job that does that. Maybe DOD, to some extent state, but even then not to the level of exposure. And so it's understanding what reality is. Do you have the skills for that? Like I was dual-hatted for a few times during my tenure as communications director. I loved the planning and the strategy. And to be blunt, I was probably better at that than I was on the day-to-day interaction. So think about what you're good at, and then talk to people and say, hey, based on what I know, this is what I think of the job. What are your experiences? What are the skill sets? And then figure out, what'll get me into that realm, right? It's like a stock. This is, past performance is no guarantee of future returns, but, generally speaking, being in the game is going to get you an opportunity at a couple of these places. Sitting on the sidelines in California or Montana is not going to get you a White House job in communications. So recognizing how some of those paths move up and who's got them and how can you talk to them is to me a great way of understanding that.
Sean, this was excellent. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for kicking it off.
Yeah, this is excellent.